Hello, friends. Welcome to Be Waste Wise. This is Shweta Dandapani from India, and I am a community builder at Be Waste Wise. Today, we have a very special panel. We have Robert Crocker, who is the Deputy Director at China-Australia Center for Sustainable Urban Development, moderating a panel for us. In fact, this is the first panel he's going to be moderating at Be Waste Wise. We have a few more scheduled for the rest of the year. And we have invited Vaughan Levitzke, who has worked on several initiatives in waste management in South Australia. This panel is going to be 45 minutes long, and towards the end, we will be taking questions from the audience. So please feel free to use the live chat box that you see below and put your questions out there. And now I'm going to hand it over to Robert. They will introduce themselves further and get started with the questions. So let me mute myself, and we'll have Robert and Vaughan unmute themselves.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our little conversation. I think I should probably mention Vaughan is the Chief Executive Officer of Green Industries SA, which is a government organisation charged with resource management, resource efficiency, and basically the greening of the local economy. Yeah, so it's quite an important and multi-dimensional role. So I think my first question, Vaughan, is how did you get into waste? Because you've been in this game for a long time.
Some might say too long. No, I have an interesting kind of beginning. I actually read a book when I was in high school that led me into the idea of consumerism and waste. And it's this one here, and it's The Waste Makers by Vance Packard. And many of your audience, I'm sure, have seen it or read it. But I did a degree in ecology at the University of Adelaide. I got into mapping habitat and botanical associations, nothing to do with waste, but environment. And then I got into remote sensing from the mapping approach. And then I was offered a position in the Environment Protection Authority to work in waste management. And it was a regulatory role. And I thought, well, this will be interesting. And it's not something I've ever done before, but I'm up for the challenge. But going in there without any background, and then I could ask all of the difficult questions that most people didn't have answers to. And so for me, that was the interesting part. For once, I found that in terms of environmental impacts, the environment's actually quite fine. We can map the habitat, we can map where species are and all that sort of thing. But in terms of the real impacts are coming from us.
Yeah.
And it's the human behaviours that are causing the impacts. And that kind of sparked my interest. And that became the path for me to try and work out how we're going to change human behaviour, how we're going to build infrastructure and other systems to enable us to mitigate against that impact.
So you've had a number of really important successes in your role, one being the container deposit scheme, which I think was second in the world here in Adelaide,
1977.
77, yes.
So I can't claim responsibility for that. I was still in school,
yeah.
But it was an important thing that was done here. So Oregon and South Australia are kind of sister states in terms of early adoption of container deposit systems.
Yeah.
And I had the good fortune of running the container deposit system when I worked at the EPA.
Right.
And I went through a process of expanding it at that time. So in 2003, we applied it to not just beer and soft drinks, but to water in bottles. We applied it to things like sports drinks, a whole range of products that when it was invented in 1977, no one ever thought we would be drinking or consuming. So it was ready for a huge uplift. We got that through, and then in 2008, the EPA increased the deposit from 5 cents to 10 cents. And it's been a really successful scheme for many, many years. Now the rest of Australia is following suit. So New South Wales have introduced, Northern Territory, Queensland, Western Australia is about to. So yeah, it's kind of led the way.
It's very interesting now, because when you look back on that, you can see how even the drinks companies are beginning to fall behind this instead of opposing it, which is quite interesting.
I think the debate around single-use plastics, which is kind of where we're at now, has raised the public view around all of this as a matter of urgency. And I think if you're a beverage manufacturer, or if you're a plastics manufacturer, a packaging manufacturer, the times have changed. You can't keep pushing back on regulation, keep pushing back on what is actually probably common sense, and not take some form of responsibility for the products you're putting into the market. So I'm seeing that change, and it's mostly, it used to be niche, small companies that were, now some of the majors are starting to take a different view. So I think that we're at an interesting time now. There's some big changes afoot.
And what about the plastic bag ban? How did you learn? What did you learn from that?
It's not easy. In the plastic bag ban, we've had a ban in South Australia that I was kind of responsible for since 2008. It's when the legislation came in, and then in 2009 it took effect. But there was a long history to it. So in 1997, we had a plastic bag summit here in Adelaide. And I'd already, because I was working for the EPA at the time, I'd already worked out what the regulatory framework might look like for that summit, so we could talk about what would happen should we want to go down a regulatory path. And it became very evident to me, even then, there were only two options. You either ban or you put a price on the bags. And so in Ireland, they put the price. In here, we put a ban. And the reason we chose to go down the path of a ban was because it's very hard to keep track of the money. And people can become quite cynical of large corporate supermarket chains, for example. You're charging us for these bags. Where's the money going? Yeah,
exactly. It's not a container deposit scheme.
No, it's not. But that, the genesis of all this from container deposits probably helped us with the plastic bag ban, because people in this state are more environmentally aware as a result of container deposits. So from an early age, kids have been picking up bottles and cashing them in for money. And it's a common thing for families to collect all their bottles, take them to a depot and get $20, $30 and cash them in.
So, you've mentioned some of the regulatory initiatives. What about the hope a lot of people now put on technology for fixing? I mean, the scale of, you've been around Southeast Asia, you've presented to the UN on a number of occasions. You have this regional view, which is, I mean, this is the area where some of the worst marine pollution is occurring, plastic pollution. Can we do more than, I mean, for example, here it's quite possible to ban the plastic bag, to have a container deposit scheme. What about these developing nations? How can they deal with this? And is there a sort of a technological fix that can help them, or does technology run in parallel? I mean, I'd just like your thoughts on the regional aspect of this.
There's technology and then there's technology.
Right.
So for some places, they've chosen to go down a technological path of waste to energy as the solution. And unfortunately, I don't think it's panning out to be the solution. Even in places like Denmark, where they have strong emphasis on waste to energy and have invested heavily in it. The government and everybody there is trying to get out of it now. So to keep the waste plants running, they import waste from other jurisdictions. The opportunity is lost when you go to energy, because you miss the opportunity of recycling those materials back through the economy in what we call a circular economy. So whilst the waste to energy, it looks like a silver bullet, most times, either because of the technology, it's very difficult to maintain in developing countries, or it's difficult to build the systems and the structure in place that enables it to exist, the collection systems and so on that you still need for waste to energy. It's not a panacea. And then I come to, well, what else is there? And it's really interesting to see the technological change in packaging over the years. So now we have multifaceted packaging that can keep oxygen out, keep CO2 in. We use glues, we use a whole range of different membrane technologies to maintain food and keep food fresh and ensure that it has a long shelf life. So the technology advancement in some aspects, including the built environment, more and more we're getting smarter at the types of materials we're using and so on, because they're either thermal properties or whatever, but we don't have a solution for them at the end of life.
Yes.
So we keep introducing new technology, but we forget that we're going to have to deal with this stuff when it comes out of the system, when it comes out of the built environment or out of households or out of businesses. And we need to be thinking smarter and designing technologies that enable us to deal with it when it comes out of the system. And I know there's a lag time, but for many single-use products, like single-use plastics, that there's such a churn rate that it's being developed, it's being put into the market, and then we find we've got a problem. And the problem is growing exponentially as we put more and more material back into the environment. So technology around design, technology about designing out waste, technology to enable the post-consumer treatment of these materials so that we can reuse them, technology such that we can design things that can be disassembled, that we can recover the materials and we can put them back into the productive economy. That's the kind of technology we need to be focusing on, certainly from my perspective.
And I guess the thing that fascinates me is how do you fit regulation into the system? Because as you were saying, the churn is so rapid. Every few weeks, I'm sure, or few months, there's a new plastic, there's a new solution that somebody's come up with. But these solutions are what you might call post-cautionary. They're not looking at the afterlife. They're not looking at the environmental impact. How do you get manufacturers, designers to actually start taking this seriously? Because they're not the ones paying at the end. It's all of us. It's our environment.
This is that's the $64 million question.
Good.
Historically, we've not, the market hasn't taken account of the post-consumer issues. So the market that we've constructed, the economic system is all about getting scale, getting mass-produced, getting products to people that are cheap and easily adopted. We haven't yet closed the loop, to coin a phrase, but the opportunity is there for those manufacturers to actually do that. And if they can solve the problem for their products, they can solve the problem for a whole range of other products as well. And that means that they've got a global market for the solution. But all too often, they're constrained in their thinking by the fact that they have to keep producing the traditional product into the traditional market in the traditional way, and then wonder why nothing changes.
it's a sunk cost effect or fallacy.
Yeah.
So once you've got the machines, you don't want to change them because it's costly. You just keep pumping it out.
And to get to your question about the regulation aspect, regulation unfortunately has always followed along behind where the market goes. It's always been playing catch up. So whether you look at DDT, dieldrin, and all of the asbestos, if you look at all of the products that have been put into the marketplace, the regulation has always come along after the event. It's to clean it up. The current one is PFAS and PFOS, firefighting foams. We always somehow manage to let these things into the market. It's claimed to have been tested, and then we find out there's a problem, and then we have to close the door on it. And it's very difficult. And it's very difficult for a number of reasons. There's already been so much investment in the technology to produce the stuff. You already have a market which has already been well established and is addicted to it. So they can't find an alternative because it's the most effective bug spray known to mankind, therefore they keep wanting to use it. And finally, we have a system that says the market's all important. We need to maintain the flow of materials and money. Otherwise, our economy and our key performance indicators, our GDP, will suffer if we adopt a regulatory approach which is too heavy-handed. So a number of countries, including Australia, has been working on extended producer responsibility. And it's taken many forms here, everything from a voluntary arrangement all the way through to a mandatory arrangement. Voluntary arrangements, in my experience, work really well for a handful of large companies that have 100% market share. So they can collaborate, they can work together. In this country, the newsprint industry is the classic. So they set about making themselves targets and putting in systems to make sure that the newspapers are recycled. And they've done a remarkable job. It's all taken care of. And they did it without any regulation. Then we have the packaging industry, which is kind of half-half. The Australian Packaging Covenant looks to make it mandatory. In other words, if you don't join up to the covenant, you have to put in place a system through curbside collection for your packaging. So everybody chooses to join up to the covenant, which is a voluntary scheme. But you would argue that that's probably not terribly voluntary, but it's, as I said, it's this halfway house. But then there are still free riders. So people who might import either packaging or products, say from China or from the US, they choose not to be part of the scheme, but they sell into the market. How do you find them? How do you regulate? Or sorry, how do you enforce? How do you apply penalties which make disincentivize that activity? And I think they're the difficult areas for governments and for the policing, because all too often people look at the cost of regulation, and enforcement is usually the biggest cost. It's not actually the impact on the businesses, it's the enforcement actions. And for enforcement, you need really good governance, and you need really, corruption shouldn't enter into the stream at all. This has to be above board, it has to be transparent, and it has to be diligent. And I think for developing countries and in Asia and Southeast Asia, this is a real challenge. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do something. I think to have tried and failed sometimes is better than to have not ever tried at all. And I think Indonesia is now working very strongly on single-use plastics and plastic pollution. Time will tell how well that works and how it transpires, but I think the opportunities to clean up the environment, because they have a tourism business industry which is dependent on a clean environment. and no one wants to go swimming in plastic bags.
No, I've done that. No, I've done.
So there is an imperative here, and it also probably needs a global focus.
Mm. So I guess you mentioned three. You know, the voluntary, the combination where you have an association that is fairly dominant and has some regulatory, some effect with some background regulation. Are there any industries where it's just really, really hard, you know, to do anything? I'm thinking of maybe West or some of the other.
We do have an extended producer responsibility scheme for e-waste in Australia, and it had early teething problems, but it's getting better. But to get to the point, though, I think the problem that the developed world has is that it's been relying on the developing world as a disposal point for the materials that they've collected. And so the China sword instance, and now China's saying, we're not having any more of this stuff, is an epiphany for some. And it's probably long overdue. And to be honest, I think China should be congratulated for the approach. And now I see India, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand also taking a similar approach. No one wants to be the dumping ground for this stuff. And it's beholden on the developed world to find the solutions.
Yes.
We're producing this stuff in the main, designing it in a market system that we've designed. It's up to us, I think, to find largely to find the solutions for it as well. So the opportunity, I think, that presents, not just developed countries, but developing countries, to come up with solutions, to come up with new technology that enables us to deal with this material in a more profound way, would be, I think, as a global application.
And I think also there are market opportunities in that as well. So, I think, so moving on, the circular economy is really something that plays into this very much. Do you want to talk a little bit about the circular economy? After all, you have tried to develop and initiate the circular economy in South Australia, which is very difficult because we don't make very many things. But I just be interested to see you know, what your take is on the circular economy and its ambition.
I think this is a really, although it seems new, it's quite old. So we've been dealing with this for a long time in recycling and servitization in the economy and those sorts of things. It's not new, but I think that the phrase circular economy, or the two words circular economy, places our agenda firmly in the economic frame. And that's different to the way we've treated it in the past. In the past, it was all about the environment. It was about diverting waste from landfill. It was about efficiency, efficiency in business, efficiency in government or whatever. Now it's in the economic frame. That allows us to also talk about not just the savings, but how we build an economy which is more sustainable and able to last survive.
Yes.
Survive. And to be honest, we're at a position now, I think, in our linear economy where we just can't keep doing things the way we've always done them. This is and this is the opportunity to change. So China gets that, India understands that, the European Union understands that. This is a global thing now.
Yes.
The difficulty, though, is measuring circularity and trying to understand the KPIs that are associated with a linear economy, which are, you know, GDP and cost per unit production and all those sorts of things, to start thinking of measures in a circular economy. And I think that's the challenge. Because until we do that, until we get enough case studies articulated, and we can see the common elements and start articulating to businesses, this is how you should be measuring your output. It's not just about how much profit you've made. There are all these other measures that you need to take into consideration.
And what about in terms of just talking about the measures? What about the economics of circularity? Because in many ways, if something is cheap, produced in vast quantities, is then sold in today's understanding that it can be replaced in 2 years' time with a new version.
Or if it's fast fashion, it's within a week.
I know. So, how do we incentivize circularity, say in fast fashion or some of these highly problematic areas in our economy?
Again, it's a really difficult question. I think fundamentally, so much of this comes back to education and knowledge.
Yeah.
And for people to realize that it's not cool to keep buying stuff and chucking it away just because it looks good. Your lounge suite looks fine for 5 years and then you want to change it for a new one. We really do need to change the way we think about our use of resources. And for me, that is about education. And as hard as that is, and as hard as it is we really need to start with, the education system and kids from an early age, so they understand and they can take the message home and ask the questions: why do we have to buy? Why do we?
What about? Sorry, this is probably one last big one, which will really throw consumer behaviour, because you mentioned this in the beginning of our conversation. Obviously, in a world where we experience 3,000 ads every day, roughly, according to different authorities on this, you're in effect asking people to change, often without adequate information. And you mentioned education. Is there a way of ensuring, using technology, for example, that the severing of feedback that people get? I mean, when my father was growing up, he would know more or less where everything he wore or he bought came from. Now, most people have no idea. They have no idea where anything comes from. Is there a way of using technology or improving some sort of feedback loop so that consumers become more aware of this? And is there a way of standardizing this so it's not all about marketing on somebody's website? Or do you think?
Yeah, I think again, we're getting into technology.
That's
and
right.
we're getting into big data, and we're getting into the Internet of Things and all of those buzzwords. But there is already technology available that would enable people to scan something, a barcode or a RFID or a QR code, to enable them to see the genesis of the product, where it came from, who made it, how it was made, what materials are in it, its shelf life, how long has it been in transit, how long has it taken to get to you, how many resources have been used, how much water, how many people have been employed in producing this.
And are they treated well?
Yeah.
That's another one.
Is it proper labour, or is it essentially slave labour?
Yeah.
Or child labour? And those sorts of information it's possible. But some of the bigger companies need to start doing it.
That's right.
But they also need to be transparent. So it's no good saying, I'm going to do it, and then not.
So is this a role for industry associations or governments, or how do you break into this? Because this is the same sort of problem you have with plastic bag bans and legislation around materials.
I think the industry itself should start the ball rolling, and they should be testing their members if it's an association, or if it's a large corporate set of team working on how to do this, and test how it could materialize for their products. But eventually, I think, rightly or wrongly, if we end up with 53,000 different systems, that's not helpful either.
No, we have that at the moment, I think.
Yeah. So then we need to get into standards. We need to get into international standards to make sure that we're all complying with the same information collected in the same way, so that they're directly comparable. Because part of the problem is that in much of this space, I find the greenwash is prevalent. But when you scratch the surface, you find that it's not quite what we put on the label. It's slightly different now because we've changed suppliers and things like that. It's very disingenuous in a way. And I think there's probably a role for government, a significant role for government going forward. The EU is probably more across this than most other government groups that I'm aware of. So it's going to be interesting to see how the EU evolves over the next, say, 5 to 7 years, and how the rest of the world can respond to that. And because they're a big market in their own right.
Yeah, I have noticed that they've started publishing guidelines for sustainable design, for circularity, whereas before they were really leaving that up to universities and industry leaders, and
it's important that industry tests the water first, because if government just says, "Now go and do it," industry says, "Oh, we don't know how to do this." And there's this huge pushback. So it's important that industry take up the cudgel and demonstrate that they're engaged, demonstrate that they're trying to solve these problems, because there is a market opportunity here as well. Because if you solve it for one company, you can solve it for the rest.
Well, thank you. I think it's probably about time, is it? Yes.
Hey, Robert, we have a couple of questions. I've put it up there from the audience, and should I read them out to you, or would you read it out yourself?
I think you might have to read them.
That's all right. So the first question is from Karina, and she wants to know about the advances in bio-based and biodegradable polymers research in Australia.
Oh, that's an interesting. That's a really interesting question, because there's biodegradable and biodegradable. Most of the I'm not familiar with any great degree of research in Australia around biodegradable polymers. A lot of it has come out of US and Europe. Then my concern is that the biodegradable polymers are usually normal plastics with an additive. And so the polymeric chains break down through UV or other action because there's a weak link. And the weak link is usually through a heavy metal added to the, like cobalt or something else to the polymer. That just breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces until it gets so small it's in our food chain and we don't know that it's there. That's not a solution. Compostable plastics, however, that can be demonstrated to be broken down by microbes in composting operations and that sort of thing. So cornstarch bags and some of those materials, I think they have a much bigger future, but you do still need to keep them separate from all the other polymers because they're not compatible in the recycling stream. So I think more work needs to be done on the collection. It sounds silly, I know, but the logistics of getting this stuff out of the consumer society is probably one of the biggest issues, and keeping it clean.
And again, we come back to information that's available to consumers. I mean, coffee cups, most consumers have no idea what's recyclable, what's compostable. One interview we carried out said that it had a green tinge, it must be okay. so it's very, very hard, in this area. But Going on to one issue that you sort of alluded to is that there's more and more attempts to embed or reuse polymers in building materials, in roadways, and other. What do you think of that? Are we just creating a sort of a nightmare for the future where somebody has to dig these things up and somehow decontaminate the other material, the natural material that's with it? What do you say to that? The skeptics talking here.
This is a dilemma. I think for some of the more simple applications, they're relatively easily separated. It's when you form a new material from these products that doesn't have another life afterwards, that's when it becomes a problem. So it's a downcycling, but it might be I don't know, you've created a new desktop made out of multiple plastics, and those plastics are permanently mixed. There's no way we can unscramble that egg.
Yes.
What do you do with that? Or a wall panel, PVC wall panel, what do you do with that after its useful life? And I think for some of those things, we need to be thinking really carefully about whether we should be doing that or not. But there again, glass into concrete, it's silica. It's not going to.
It's not a problem.
It's not going to cause a problem.
No, I was thinking particularly of polymers because of their complexity and the fact that there's such a range. You end up. I mean, I've seen laminated tops for kitchens made out of recycled plastics, and I'm looking at it thinking, I wonder what's in there.
But it's probably got a 50-year life, if not longer, in a kitchen.
Yeah, maybe
until someone gets sick of it.
After that.
But after that, it's probably destined for either landfill or a waste-to-energy plant.
Yeah, that's right.
So, in one sense, we've extended the life of the polymer by another significant period of time. So we're getting more use out of it. So it's more efficient. But then finally, we still have a problem with the disposal.
Yeah.
And I see more and more of that probably in the built environment.
Yeah.
Panels with different things attached, or paint substrates, which we don't yet have solutions for, and they're being used everywhere. Nanoparticles is another one. How do we keep them out of the environment? How do we make sure that they're treated in an appropriate way?
The next question.
Yeah, so we have a question from Akubike from Eco Life Conservation Initiative, which is an NGO working in Nigeria. This person would like to know more about extended producer responsibility, as they have a litter cleanup project there and are looking at manufacturers of these wastes getting involved.
Okay. So for cleanups, most of the big corporates like to get involved because it's good advertising. So, for example, here McDonald's were very strong supporters of Clean Up Australia for many, many, many years. And they donated money, they donated equipment and a whole range of things. And so corporate kind of people, they like to get involved in cleanups. But when it comes to extended producer responsibility, more often than not, that's a bridge too far. So, and they like to be able to say, well, we're exercising our corporate responsibility by contributing to the cleanup. And that's fine, but there are many items and things that we're putting out into the environment through illegal dumping and a whole range of other things that we do need extended producer responsibility arrangements for. So container deposits are actually an extended producer responsibility scheme. And that's been around here since the 1970s, same in the US. And it's effectively the manufacturer puts money up front for a deposit so that the consumers can bring the material back to a depot and it gets recycled and they get their deposit back. It's very simple stuff, and it's very effective. And particularly for, I always, people say, oh yes, but you're a developed country. But, the informal sector in Asia, Africa, South America.
It's so efficient.
They are so efficient.
Yeah, that's right.
But they're so poor.
Exactly, yeah.
Because they're not able to, they're not of a market strength that's able to take advantage of the materials that they're collecting. But if, for example, Brazil had I don't know if they have or they haven't, a container deposit system, all of a sudden those collectors have a known income, a steady stream.
Yeah.
And those containers are worth at least 5 cents or whatever the local currency is. That makes it worthwhile. And now it's not the manufacturers that are paying for that, it's the consumers. So it's the people who throw it away who forego their deposit. And it's the informal sector that pick it up.
Yes.
And get the cash benefit. And so I think there is, if you wanted to try something like that, maybe a trial, work with a beverage producer that has a semblance of a thought about post-consumer impacts and suggest to them they put a deposit on their bottles and see how many you get back in a day to get a feel for what the community might respond in, how they might respond in terms of contributing and making sure that the place is cleaned up. Without having a clean-up day, it just happens anyway because the informal sector do it, or the formal sector for that matter.
Yeah, and more and more people are introducing machines to do this as well. Where machines that will recognise bottles and cans, and so in a sense you're getting something back straight away from the machine.
That's true. There's a technology that's been developed locally here in Adelaide, and it links to an ATM, so you can get cash straight away. Yeah,
yeah. Which would be a fantastic way of dealing with this problem if you could scale it up. But as our conversation suggested, there are too many new materials that are escaping this. Like the sandwiched packaging materials that you really need to quite sophisticated machinery to be able to separate. And
so that sort of technology is being built now to be able to separate that material. The latest equipment out of Europe is, it's getting better and better and better. There's a new development here in Adelaide. It's a $19 million investment for plastic sorting, mixed plastic sorting. It's phenomenal what can be done. But it all comes at a price.
Yes.
And traditionally, this market, the waste is a market failure. It goes to the lowest price or the lowest cost, whereas everything else tries to get to the highest price or the highest margin. This is the lowest. And somehow we have to incentivize the system so that it behaves differently. Extended producer responsibility is one way of making the manufacturers aware of the downstream impacts and making them responsible for it as well.
And respond to it.
Because
that's one of the problems. It's very easy if you live in a society where everything is just pushed off the table and out of the way. But we've done that for so long now, we can't continue. So I think even those who don't like the idea have to come up with something similar to deal with this problem.
So just back to the question from Nigeria, Scotland did something similar recently. Right. They put a voluntary deposit on some bottles, so the government got behind us, and now they want to roll that out across Scotland. The UK has now picked it up, and so they're now talking about a container deposit scheme across the UK. I mean, various places across Europe have been doing it since the 70s as well. So it's not new to Europe, but it is new to some jurisdictions.
We have one more question from Karina. I think that should be the last question because we're almost at the close of our webinar. She's asking, how do we address the issue of laminates? Do you think we should ban it?
Sorry, the
Laminates.
Laminates.
So laminated plastics.
Laminates in wood or laminates in plastics, or
I presume plastics.
I can't read, I'm afraid. My eyesight's
She hasn't mentioned it specifically, so I'm assuming it's laminates in plastic, actually. So
yeah, and then do you think we should ban it?
Yeah. Banning's always tempting.
Depends where it's being used. Now, too often I think we jump to the ban solution, and that's not necessarily the best outcome, because it could well be that the laminate is serving a much higher purpose in terms of protecting or extending shelf life or whatever. What we should be doing is coming up with solutions for laminates in a recycling technology so that we can get the advantages of them, but also deal with them at the other end. Now, until such time as we've got a solution, yeah, I think we should be canvassing with the companies that produce it to say to them, have you thought about
end of life?
End of life.
Yeah.
How are you going to address it? And start having those hard discussions, because if it's not recyclable, in this country anyway, we have targets now for 2025 for 100% recycling, compostable, or yeah. So for them to ignore the problem will be at their peril, because I think ultimately the risk is that they will face some form of market restriction on their products, and no one wants to necessarily see that.
I think what has been demonstrated in this conversation is the iterative nature of resource management, that we have to keep responding to the market, and we have to keep, in a sense, keeping this discussion on, you said the market failure, in a sense, that requires economic, social, material solutions that are being continuously developed in response to changes that we see around us, rather than chasing perhaps a universal solution that fixes things. Plastics, for example, are the cat's out of the bag. We can't necessarily get it back in, but we have to deal with what we have. Out there.
The media and the constant publicity around marine plastics and marine plastic pollution has seen the importance of this rise in the public perception like no other environmental issue.
Yeah.
And I think we're on we did a survey, a survey here, a consultation paper around phasing out various single-use plastics. It's had the highest response to anything the government has done from the public.
Right.
And it's all about, yes, we need to fix it, we need government intervention, and we need to solve the problem.
Very good, very good.
So I think the public's actually engaged. Now it's a matter of translating that into action.
Well, thank you so much, Vaughan, for what has been a very interesting, and is this the time we stop?
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Vaughan. Do you have, I know you pretty much summarized it, but do you have any other last thoughts to add before we close the session?
I just think there are probably 3 or 4 key issues that globally we need to focus on. Food waste and the resources that go with that. So all the energy and the labour and the fertilizers and everything else, the productive capacity of our land and so on. It's a hugely important issue, and we should never disregard that. That's probably one of the key issues we have to focus on going forward. Single-use plastics. So plastics have performed a remarkable thing in our economy and in the way we live, but we need to solve the solution in terms of into the marine environment and also into the terrestrial environment. And then I think we need to also start to think about how we build a circular economy in terms of, in the next 10 to 15, 20 years, making sure that we have systems in place that can not only measure but also enable people to conduct businesses in a circular fashion. And I failed to mention the SDGs in any of the discussion. That, I think, offers a framework for countries and for people to participate in, which means that we have coherence, we can collaborate, we have cohesion, we're working on the same things in the same, using the same tools to get these things fixed on a global scale. I think that offers huge hope going forward. But I'm also reminded that if we can't keep hoping that it's going to happen, we actually have to do it.
Yeah, that's right.
So time is of the essence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And to those who are watching, I'd like to remind you that Robert Crocker is going to be moderating a few more panels with us. Mostly the next one will be in the month of May. And in keeping with Vaughan's point about food waste, next week we have a panel on optimizing food rescue operations. We have Kate Bailey, who is going to be moderating that one. So please go to our website, go to events, and register for that panel as well. Thank you both, Robert and Vaughan. It was absolutely great. We managed to live tweet a little bit of what you said. And the panel will be available for everyone, for public to view by next week. And that's it. Thanks a lot. Have a good day in whichever part of the world you're at right now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So